All right, welcome back to my IELTS speaking course for achieving 6.5 to maybe 7.5. Basically 6.5 and beyond. Again, I'm not saying you will get a 7.5 by studying the course, but we're going to be talking about the skills that will get you beyond a 6 and as close to a 7.5 as possible. This is lesson 2. We're going to be talking about part 1, frame 1 again. Again, remember, it's not really just about frame 1. It's about the context for really improving in lots of language you can use across the whole test. I'm starting my examples from the very beginning, but they can be used all across the test. Do not forget this, and do not skip through my initial lessons, because they are the foundation. Right, so welcome. Let's recap quickly. Why bother prepare and train for part 1? It's a perfect way to train yourself. It's a great warm-up in the test itself. You can raise your score a lot with a strong part 1. Part 1 is very important. It covers a huge range of different topics and basically all the tenses in English conversational language, and it's an ideal training ground for high-scoring performance in general. Right, my part 1 lessons. You're going to learn and train yourself to give grammatically correct extended answers. Advanced sophisticated answers does not mean overly complicated language. Natural, educated, native speaker lexical chunks, word groups, correctly used. Part 1 is a foundation, a preparation, a build-up to part 2 and 3. Follow me in this course and you will see exactly why and how. You must do, remember, active listening and notes. Pause, rewind, keep your notes, write your own answers, record your answers on a DRD. Don't memorize whole answers. Don't. Memorize lexical chunks and word groups. Do. Memorize lexical chunks and learn to use them in multiple different answers. You can practice. Part 1 questions. There's always 3 topics covered in part 1. Where you live or study, and 2 more random topics that the examiner chooses from many, many possibilities. Follow-up questions. The examiner always asks follow-up questions. This is an invitation to shine, get high-scoring answers, and we're going to talk about follow-up questions. Would you consider... So yes, this is a follow-up question for a frame 1, but it could be a question for any part of the whole test. So remember, when I'm teaching you and training you about a part of part 1, what I'm teaching you and training you about can be used in any aspect of spoken language to answer many types of questions. So, follow-up questions. Would you consider? So in the last lesson, we were talking about the following follow-up question. How long have you done something? In this lesson, we will talk about, would you consider doing something for a long time in the future? Would you consider is always a question about something you might think about doing in the future. Okay. So, would you consider living there a long time? So, you've just talked about where you live. The examiner asks you how long you've lived there. Then they ask, would you consider living there a long time? Would you consider continuing to study this subject in the future? Would you consider living in your city for many more years? Would you want to work in this job in the future? Do you intend to live here in many years' time? All these are the same question types. Would you consider doing something in the future? Think versatile. Versatile means flexible, being able to use something practically and very flexibly. So at every moment in this lesson and this course, everything I advise you to do, Everything I advise you about can be applied to almost any aspect of the speaking test. Think versatile. Think how you can use these techniques, lexical chunks, word groups, we learn and practice in answer to a variety of different IELTS questions. Bear this in mind. We'll be talking more about it at the end of this lesson. So, would you consider doing something for a long time? Would you consider living in Beijing for a long time? Let's see what my answer is. Would you consider living in Beijing for a long time? Well, it's interesting you say that, because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. I'm really not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's a huge, exciting and ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's just too big, overcrowded, too busy and increasingly expensive. Which words are stressed in each phrase? Let's just talk about this for a second. Stressed words in each clause, phrase or group. Well, it's interesting you say that, because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. So, think about when I'm speaking, when I'm reading the answers, when I'm speaking out the answers, my answers. Think about the words I'm stressing and where I'm putting the pauses. I keep emphasizing this in my lessons. I just want you to remember to listen out for this. Pronunciation. Think about it whenever you hear me speaking. Sentence stress. Words that are emphasized more. We usually stress and emphasize the content words. That's the important words in our answers. Pausing. Where I put very short pauses and short pauses. Chunking, how I group my words together. Words in speech that belong together and go together. Pausing before or after them, either a very short pause or a short pause. Just think about these things as I'm speaking and think about how you can imitate and incorporate these into your answers. So which words are stressed in each phrase, in each clause or group? Well, it's interesting you say that, because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. I'm really not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's huge, exciting, and an ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's just too big, overcrowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. Okay, let's get into it. The examiner has just asked me where I live. The examiner has just asked me where you live. He follows up with another question. Would you consider living in Beijing for a long time? Let's break it down. Focus on the meaning of everything in my answer now. Well, it's interesting you say that, because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. I'm really not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's huge, exciting, and ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's just too big, overcrowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. Note, I do not include my own opinion exactly. I'm not sure. I do not say whether I would or would not like to continue living here in the future, yet I do answer the examiner's question. It's okay to say, I'm not sure how I feel. I'm not sure what my opinion is, as long as you give reasons to develop your answer. In fact, like my example, you can give a more intelligent and high-scoring answer sometimes by expressing you're not sure and showing both sides, even in part 1. So let's look at my logic, my answer logic. I start with a very colloquial native speaker introduction. I say I'm not totally sure about my opinion. I then weigh up both sides, the things I like and dislike about Beijing, very concisely. I give reasons with great adjectives, but simple adjectives, for my feelings. I do all of these things like a native speaker, and there are no complicated words. It's simply the way I put my answer together. So, managing my introduction, managing our introduction, number one. Would you consider living in Beijing a long time? Well, it's interesting you say that, because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. This is a discourse management introduction, a discourse marker introduction. It makes you sound like a native. It sounds natural. This is how people sometimes speak. It buys you time. You're extending your answer from the start of your answer. And you're showing the use of different tenses. It's interesting you say that. Just a few days ago, I was discussing this with some friends. I've shown the use of present tense, past tense, prepositions of time, adjective markers, all in a short sentence. The examiner is listening for all of this, and I've used them all correctly and flexibly. What am I doing here? Next, I'm weighing up both sides. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's huge, exciting, ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's just too big, overcrowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. So, I'm introducing some likes. That's what I'm doing in my next part. Before we then introduce dislikes, I say, on the one hand, I really like Beijing. It's a huge, exciting, and ever-changing city. On the one hand, introducing likes. It's a huge, exciting, ever-changing city. I'm using 3 adjectives in a row. Meaning plus rhythm. So I'm giving meaning, but I'm conveying a native speaker rhythm. This is a very native speaker way of talking, to use 2 or 3 adjectives. It's a huge, exciting, ever-changing city. Pause. 3, the 3 adjective technique. Using 3 adjectives in a row. A tall, modern, impressive building. A vast, green, beautiful landscape. A horrible, dirty, polluted town. You don't have to use 3, actually. You could use 2, but this is just an example. But in these kind of answers, try to use more than 1. Prepare lexical chunks to describe many different things using this 2 or 3 adjective technique. Remember them. Use them in multiple answers. You don't have to just use them in part 1, frame 1 answers. This is just the example. A tall, modern, impressive building. A vast, green, beautiful landscape. A horrible, dirty, polluted town. Think you can use this in a part 2, in a part 3, many different answers. Great adjective constructions, and they raise your pronunciation and fluency score because you've got pausing, stress, and rhythm. Read the sentence again, weighing up both sides in one sentence. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's a huge, exciting, and ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's just too big, overcrowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. Introducing dislikes. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. We can use the 3 adjective technique here too, instead, because I want to follow with another technique. I keep this simple, partly for variety, partly because I want to continue saying what I'm saying. So let's move on. 4, elaborating on our dislikes. Elaborating, giving more information. It's just too big, too crowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. Wow, I extend it to 4 adjectives here. Maybe this is too much, but still, you get the idea. I do this for strong emphasis to show emotion. I also add adverbs. Too big, too busy, increasingly expensive. Native speakers very often emphasize emotions and feelings by adding adverbs to modify their adjectives. Simple adverbs, really, to, increasingly. Not complicated. So, notice none of the words I use are complex or complicated. It's the way they are connected and spoken that is the key. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's huge, exciting, ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's too big, overcrowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. So none of these words are really highly academic, but they sound so native in the way I have put them together. So, adverbs modifying adjectives. High-scoring descriptions can be gained from modifying our adjectives with adverbs more often. It's quite an underdeveloped town. It's a really beautiful old temple. Shenzhen is an especially interesting city. The Seoul Sky Tower is an exceedingly tall building. Again, very, very native speaker things to do. We constantly modify our adjectives with quite normal adverbs like quite, really, especially, exceedingly, if we're talking about something really, really dramatic. It can be used in multiple answers in the test. All of these things do not relate specifically to part 1. They can be used all over the test. So, continuing this, natural sounding collocations. So we can use those almost in any context. Again, it's quite cold outside. She was really beautiful. It was an especially tough day today. He was in a particularly good mood. Notice they're not complicated or highly academic or difficult words, but they sound very native. This is how to get beyond a 6.5 to a 7 and ideally beyond that. So, adverbs modifying adjectives, high-scoring collocations. It was a strangely quiet night. Beijing is getting increasingly expensive. He was dangerously close to making John angry. She did unsurprisingly well in her exams. She's always been really smart. I was dreadfully bad at sports in school. I've always been terribly bad at saving money. My teacher, Mr. Liu, used to be viciously unkind to us. She is an exceedingly attractive young woman. Notice again how the use of adverbs and adjectives together and my pausing and my stressing makes the sentence flow like a native. Copy me, practice my rhythm, practice my stressing and pausing. This will really help you, make you feel more native. So let's go back to my model answer. Would you consider living in Beijing for a long time? Well, it's interesting you say that because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. I'm really not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, I really like Beijing because it's a huge, exciting and ever-changing city. On the other hand, I find it overwhelming. It's just too big, overcrowded, too busy, and increasingly expensive. Think versatile. That's what I said in the beginning. Versatile means flexible and practical. Applying language and techniques to different situations. Think versatile. I said earlier about applying word groups, lexical chunks to a wide variety of questions. I really now want to prove this to you using today's lesson content as an example. An example of versatile learning. Different questions, but the same language patterns. Our follow-up question today was, would you consider living in Beijing for a long time? So let's use a totally different question. How has education changed since you were a child? Very different question altogether. Let's look at my language. So using the same language in other answers flexibly. How has education changed since you were a child? Well, interesting you say that because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. I'm really not sure. It depends where you're talking about. On the one hand, in big cities like Beijing, education has changed a lot. The quality of teaching is better. The classroom facilities have improved a lot. but it's becoming increasingly expensive. On the other hand, in smaller countryside towns, I do not think education has changed much, and classrooms are still overcrowded with not enough teachers. Notice how some of the chunks are used. Obviously not exactly the same, because the topic is different, but some of the same chunks of language are flexibly used. How has education changed since you were a child? Well, it's interesting you say that, because just a few days ago I was discussing this with some friends of mine. I'm really not sure. It depends where you're talking about. On the one hand, in big cities like Beijing, education has changed a lot. The quality of teaching is better. The classroom facilities have improved a lot. But it's becoming increasingly expensive. On the other hand, in smaller countryside towns, I do not think education has changed much, and classrooms are still overcrowded with not enough decent teachers. So, task for you now. Write down all the lexical chunks, the word groups, the groups of words, the phrases you have learnt today. Check them. Go back over the lesson content. Take a look at the typical IELTS speaking questions on the slide which I'm going to show you that follows. Write answers to all of them. Use what we have covered in this lesson to do so, but flexibly. Speak your answers out loud. Which words are you going to stress in each phrase? Where are you placing those very short and those short pauses? Is there any way you can improve your answers? Check them for grammar as well. Make sure they're 25 to 30 seconds speaking time maximum. You can say a lot in a short space of time. So, IELTS questions. Write and speak answers to all of the below questions. Write many, many different answers as well. Would you consider living in your town or city forever? Would you like to continue studying the same thing for years? How is your town or city changing? Why do some people like to live in smaller cities or towns, and others prefer to live a long time in a big modern city? So these questions are a little bit different than what we've learnt today, but all the things we've learnt can be flexibly used and put together to answer them. This is what I want to continue to train you to do. But you have to write examples and you have to practice them. Otherwise you won't remember. So, thank you very much. And remember, go back through this lesson, pause, practice, write down answers, record yourself, correct yourself, be very self-critical, and listen to how I'm pronouncing my phrases, because this will help you increase your pronunciation, but also your fluency. Thank you very much.